I think the European leaders, who of course are speaking today to Zelensky, are trying to give him advice on how best to handle Donald Trump so you don't end up with another Oval Office nightmare.
Now, all eyes are on Washington this week. As Alexis mentioned, a number of European leaders will join Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for a meeting at the White House, including France's Emmanuel Macron, Germany's Friedrich Merz and the European Commission's Ursula von der Leyen. It follows the summit between the US President and Vladimir Putin on Friday, which was a less bombastic outing from the normally rather garrulous President Trump. He said very few words afterwards. He didn't even take questions from journalists. A little earlier on, I caught up with the Times' insanely hardworking Washington editor, Katy Balls, who explained just why that was.
Yes, we normally have the Ask Me Anything president, particularly in the second term, where he will just wax lyrical with the travelling press pack. Not always positively, but he'll give answers. And instead, you had quite a strange situation where about 300 journalists had gone to Alaska for the summit. They were expecting there to be some type of press conference with questions. The suggestion had been, if it goes to plan, there will be this press conference with, two stands for the two men. That bit happened, and then you'll be able to speak to them after. Now, it feels as though perhaps they had less to say. I mean, it was only 12 minutes long. I think the other thing that was really striking about the press conference was the fact that Putin spoke first. So you had a situation whereby on American soil, it is the Russian leader rather than the American leader leading the charge.
I mean, Trump, never knowingly underselling himself or his own performance, called it a 10. It is important to him how all of this goes down at home, isn't it? And how is the Alaska summit being viewed by people in the US?
Yeah, I think this is one of the interesting things, which is the Ukraine-Russia conflict is one that Donald Trump wants to solve. But of course, the factors that matter most to American audience will vary to a degree to those in Europe, the UK. And it's important to Donald Trump because he wants to look like he's a winner. He'd also quite like the Nobel Peace Prize, we know. He feels he probably should have had it already. But also within his base, there is an annoyance and unhappiness at how many American dollars have already been spent on the Ukraine conflict, and a sense of if you're going to get back to the America First agenda, you need to end that. So he needs to look as though he's not being played by Vladimir Putin, but he also needs to look as though he can bring this to an end, which answers those concerns. I think when it comes to US voter perceptions of the conflict, we know the MAGA base and MAGA Republicans, as we might call them, are the most skeptical, particularly of economic funding of this war. I think that Republican Trump voters, who we wouldn't call MAGA, can be a little bit warmer towards it. And certainly, I think polling has shown in recent months a slight softening in some of the attitudes. But I think that can also be linked to the fact that in recent months, at times, not on Friday, Donald Trump has been more critical of Vladimir Putin.
Of course, Volodymyr Zelensky is now heading to DC tomorrow to meet with Donald Trump. Katy, what sort of a welcome do you think he will receive at the White House?
You would expect it to be warmer than the last time he was at the Oval Office.
You'd
of
hope
course,
so.
You could say that's a pretty low bar. But in that infamous meeting where it so quickly went from fairly okay to a very negative meeting, which really perhaps changed the course of history in terms of Russia, Ukraine, the months that have followed since, where Zelensky was criticised by figures in the Oval Office, a journalist, for not wearing a suit. J.D. Vance suggested he should be more grateful. I think the tone should be warmer, part because I think there's an effort by the US side to show progress with Ukraine, particularly since the minerals deal they signed, and also because I think Zelensky realised that he did actually make a mistake there in terms of rising to the bait, and there has expressed regret since on that, thinking he could have handled the administration better. And I think the European leaders, who of course are speaking today to Zelensky, are trying to give him advice on how best to handle Donald Trump so you don't end up with another Oval Office nightmare.
He'll be going into it fully armed. Armed, with advice this time, hopefully.
Yeah.
Katy, let's talk about the First Lady. At the Alaska meeting, Donald Trump gave a letter from his wife, from Melania, to Vladimir Putin. Do we know what it said?
We know that it was about children and the plight of children in the Ukraine-Russia war. And Melania was talking about the power that Putin had, saying all children deserve happiness. He could bring back the melody of laughter. By bringing this war to a close. And this also touches on, of course, that we don't know how specifically this was mentioned in the letter, but one of the big issues going on is the fact that Ukrainian children have been taken to Russia. And you have Zelensky and others saying as part of any peace deal, they must be returned. Of course, there's also the more general point of children in war. And I think the fact that Melania Trump wrote quite a personal letter, from what we understand, and Donald Trump personally handed it over to Putin, and he is said to have read it, or at least some of it there and then. I think does add to the sense that there is a big push from the US side by various means to try and bring this to a close. Of course, I think the bigger issue when it comes to what Zelensky can accept, where this is going to go, is going to be about trading territory, which is something where perhaps Donald Trump is going to be looser on than Zelensky. But on the return of children in the war, they probably are perhaps more in sync.
And we've been told that Melania has privately and constantly lobbied Donald Trump over the conflict in Ukraine. How much sway do we think she really holds as First Lady and as his wife?
I think a partner always holds some sway because they're the figure that you are going home to a degree. So you have advisors in any political setting who often will constantly lobby to be near their boss. There's that sense of who is in the room, who gets to walk in, who has to get a meeting, and that's how you influence. So naturally, the person who you come home to, who you have private time with, is going to shape and influence your thinking, whether that is in a formal role or informally. And I think one of the things Donald Trump has spoken about in the past is he feels that he gets on personally with Vladimir Putin. They will have a phone conversation. He'll think, oh, I can work with this guy. And then he gets home and Melania will have the television on and he'll see what, Putin has just, bombed a part of Ukraine. So it feels that is a conversation that's happening at home, as well as a topic that's discussed in the office.
Yeah, and we have heard before that he does like to go home and discuss things with Melania, that there is very much a kind of a sounding board sort of aspect to their relationship. Yeah. Katy, it's hard to look beyond Monday and the Zelensky summit in the White House, of course, but what else should we be keeping an eye on this week?
Well, I think Ukraine-Russia is clearly going to be one of the big pushes. You also have the efforts to take back Washington, D.C. By Donald Trump when it comes to cleaning up the city. And I think it's an interesting question as to how the Democrats are responding to this, because there's more police presence. They've had to change some of their plans. But I think the Republicans here feel as though the Democrats are falling into their trap by getting into an argument about how, crime's not perfect, but it's not quite as bad as Donald Trump says. And that is one of the political fights that Donald Trump wants to have. And then I think also just looking further ahead, I mean, we've obviously just had the Alaska summit. We'll have Zelensky on Monday, and then the ramifications from that probably for the rest of the week and beyond. But then you get to September, and there's a visit Donald Trump's pretty excited about, which is the second state visit in the UK.
Gosh, yes, that's coming up quite fast now, isn't it? We've sort of taken our eye off that with everything that's going on. Just before I let you go, Katy, just as a DC resident, as you said, Donald Trump has, employed the National Guard in DC. Has it felt different? Has it looked different this week?
I wouldn't say it's felt particularly different, but there are pockets of DC where it has. So you can see, obviously, there's been protests in some areas, and you can see there's been a heavy police presence. I've certainly spotted a few more police figures walking out and about, but not so much as to feel as though the outside has drastically changed. But we'll see if that changes, of course, in the coming weeks or so.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was the Times' Washington editor, Katy Balls.